There is a moment in nearly every man's life when he realizes something terrifying. Not that he is weak, not that he is lost, not even that he is suffering, but that nobody knows. And perhaps worse, nobody asks. Eros, somewhere tonight, a man sits alone in his room. His phone has not vibrated in hours. The world outside continues its endless motion. Cars pass, conversations unfold, laughter spills from restaurants and bars, families gather around dinner tables. Yet he sits in silence. He is not starving. He is not homeless. He is not visibly broken. He simply exists in a place modern society rarely notices: the invisible suffering of men. If he vanished tomorrow, some people would mourn him. But tonight, nobody checks, nobody asks, nobody notices. And perhaps you know this room. Perhaps you have sat there yourself. Perhaps you are sitting there now, because the tragedy of modern men is not merely loneliness, it is being surrounded by people while carrying your pain completely alone. When boys are young, they cry openly. They run to their mothers after falling apart. They seek comfort. They ask for help. But slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, the world begins teaching them a different language. Be strong. Man up. Stop crying. Handle it yourself. Each phrase appears harmless. Each phrase sounds practical. Yet together they build a prison. A prison where pain becomes weakness, where vulnerability becomes danger, where asking for help feels like failure. A little boy learns that tears make adults uncomfortable. A teenage boy learns that weakness invites ridicule. A grown man learns that nobody wants his burden. And so he learns silence. The frightening thing is that no one needs to explicitly teach him. He simply observes. He watches fathers suffer quietly. He watches men hide stress behind humor. He watches exhausted men continue working. He watches heartbreak swallowed. He watches fear disguised as anger. And eventually he understands. A man's pain belongs to himself. There was a man named Daniel. He worked 6 days every week. He provided for his family. He paid his bills. He attended birthdays. He smiled in photographs. Everyone described him the same way. He's doing well. One afternoon, he died by suicide. At the funeral, people repeated a sentence that has become painfully common. We had no idea. Eros, the truth is often far more uncomfortable. Sometimes people had an idea. They simply never asked. Or perhaps they asked the wrong questions. How's work? Everything okay? You good? Men become experts at answering these questions. Fine. Just tired. Everything's okay, because men quickly learn that most people want reassurance, not truth. Truth complicates things. Truth creates discomfort. Truth demands emotional labor, and so men offer the world what the world appears to prefer: a functioning mask. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung once wrote that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. But perhaps another burden exists: the unlived emotions of fathers. Many men inherit silence. A father who never cried, a grandfather who never spoke, a family where emotions existed only behind closed doors, where men expressed affection through sacrifice rather than words, where love meant provision, where concern meant responsibility, where tenderness was translated into labor. Your father may have loved you deeply, yet perhaps he never said it. Perhaps he worked himself into exhaustion. Perhaps he carried burdens nobody understood. Perhaps he sat quietly at dinner. Perhaps he stared at walls. Perhaps he drank. Perhaps he simply disappeared emotionally, not because he lacked love, but because he inherited the same silence. And now, many men stand in the ruins of generations of unspoken pain. Eros, modern society speaks often about loneliness, but it rarely speaks about male loneliness, because male loneliness is peculiar. Men often have acquaintances, co-workers, friends, football groups, online communities, yet many possess very few people they can truly call when life collapses. Many men have never said out loud, "I am afraid. I feel lost. I don't know what to do. I am struggling." And this silence becomes dangerous, because pain that cannot be spoken begins to transform. Sadness becomes anger. Fear becomes aggression. Loneliness becomes withdrawal. Failure becomes shame. The emotions do not disappear. They simply change masks. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche warned that when emotions remain buried, they do not die. They wait. And what waits in darkness often returns stronger. There is a reason many men drive alone at night. A reason some sit in parked cars after work. A reason others stay awake long after everyone sleeps. Night grants permission. The darkness removes performance. The expectations disappear. No one is watching. No one is asking. And for a brief moment, a man can exist without pretending. Perhaps you have done this. Sat in silence, scrolled endlessly, listened to music, thought about the life you imagined, thought about mistakes, thought about opportunities lost, thought about people who left, thought about the younger version of yourself, the boy who believed life would become easier, the boy who thought adulthood meant understanding, the boy who imagined that strength meant certainty. But adulthood often feels different. You realize that many men are simply carrying enormous weights while pretending they are light. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, wrote his private thoughts in the darkness of his own struggles. He ruled an empire, commanded armies, possessed immense power. Yet his journals reveal something deeply human: anxiety, fear, doubt, fatigue. The powerful man was also a vulnerable man. The strong man was also a suffering man. Perhaps this is what modern masculinity forgets. Strength is not the absence of pain. Strength is carrying pain honestly. The strongest men are not those who never struggle. They are those who refuse to let suffering make them cruel. Yet many men receive a different lesson. They believe strength means silence. Strength means emotional isolation. Strength means needing nobody. But eventually, this belief becomes unbearable because human beings were never meant to carry existence entirely alone. A young man once wrote, "I disappeared for 3 weeks and nobody noticed." The sentence spread across the internet because millions recognized themselves within it. Some men slowly stopped texting, stopped calling, stopped attending gatherings, stopped reaching out, and astonishingly very little changes. The world continues. Life moves. No one knocks. No one asks. The message becomes devastating. Perhaps I matter less than I thought. This is why many men develop an extraordinary relationship with usefulness. They feel valuable only when needed. When working, providing, solving, helping, producing, because usefulness earns attention. But existence alone, many men quietly believe they have not earned that. Who checks on the man when he cannot perform? Who checks on the provider when he cannot provide? Who comforts the protector? Who carries the man who carries everyone else? Eros, there is an old image, a bridge. Hundreds cross it every day. The bridge carries them, supports them, protects them. Yet nobody thanks the bridge. Nobody asks whether the bridge is cracking. Nobody wonders if the foundation is weakening. People notice only when it collapses. Many men live exactly this way. They become bridges for families, friends, partners, children, co-workers. Everyone crosses. Everyone depends. Very few ask, "How are you carrying all this?" And eventually, the bridge begins to fracture. Not dramatically, quietly. Fatigue, irritation, emotional numbness, withdrawal, exhaustion. The collapse begins long before anyone sees it. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the hidden self, the rejected parts, the emotions we bury because they feel unacceptable. For many men, sadness enters the shadow. Fear enters the shadow. Tenderness enters the shadow. Dependency enters the shadow. The result is not emotional strength. The result is emotional amputation. And amputated parts do not disappear. They haunt us. A man unable to express sadness may express rage. A man unable to seek love may pursue validation. A man unable to admit fear may become controlling. A man unable to grieve may become cold. This is why emotional neglect creates strange wounds. You survive, you function, you continue. Yet some part of you slowly becomes unreachable. And perhaps this is why so many men feel disconnected from themselves. Because the person they show the world is not the person suffering inside. Eros, there is a particular kind of pain that comes from realizing nobody truly knows you. Not your job, not your accomplishments, not your image, You, the fears, the doubts, the grief, the memories, the nights you almost broke, the failures that still visit you, the dreams you abandoned. To be unseen is painful, but to feel unseeable is devastating. Many men no longer believe they can be known, so they stop trying, and when a man stops trying to be known, loneliness enters. Not because he lacks people, but because he lacks witnesses. There are elderly men who have not cried in 40 years. There are fathers carrying debts nobody knows about. There are sons pretending to be strong for mothers who depend on them. There are husbands terrified of losing jobs. There are young men who smile online while contemplating whether their lives matter. There are men surrounded by people who have not heard the truth in years. This is the hidden epidemic. Not simply depression, not simply loneliness, but invisibility. To feel invisible is to slowly question your existence, and the mind begins asking dangerous questions. Would anyone notice? Would anyone care? Would anything change? Eros, these questions do not always come from weakness. Sometimes they come from exhaustion, from carrying yourself for too long. Perhaps nobody checks on men because society assumes men are strong. But perhaps society mistakes endurance for wellness. A man can endure and still suffer. A man can provide and still collapse. A man can smile and still feel empty. The strongest trees sometimes rot from within. The tallest mountains still erode. The ocean itself hides storms beneath calm surfaces, and men are no different. The world sees function. The soul experiences struggle. Tonight, somewhere, a man will tell someone, "I'm fine," and he will mean, "I am tired, I am afraid, I feel forgotten. I do not know who I am becoming. I need someone to stay. I need someone to ask again, not because he is weak, but because he is human." And perhaps that is the truth we have forgotten. Men are not machines, not providers, not protectors alone, not tools, not functions. Men are human beings, and human beings require witness, connection, understanding. Someone who asks twice, someone who remains. So, Eros, if nobody has checked on you recently, hear this. Your suffering is not invisible because it lacks value. Your silence is not proof that your pain is small. The fact that you continue carrying your burdens does not mean you were meant to carry them alone. There are wounds that grow in darkness, and there are wounds that begin healing the moment they are spoken. Perhaps the tragedy is not that nobody checks on men. Perhaps the greater tragedy is that many men no longer believe they deserve to be checked on, and that belief becomes a prison. A prison built not from iron, but from years of silence, years of endurance, years of pretending, years of saying, "I'm okay," when they were not. Eros, if you have become invisible, do not disappear. If you have become silent, do not surrender your voice. If nobody has asked how you are, ask yourself honestly. Sit with your pain, name it, face it, because the road back to yourself begins with a single act of courage, admitting that you are carrying more than anyone knows, and perhaps, for the first time in years, allowing yourself to be seen. For even the strongest men were never meant to walk through the darkness alone. There comes a moment in a man's life when the weight he carries becomes so familiar that he no longer calls it pain. He calls it responsibility. He calls it adulthood. He calls it life. And because he gives his suffering another name, he stops looking for relief. Eros, the most dangerous wounds are not the ones that bleed. They are the ones that become part of your identity. The exhaustion that becomes normal. The anxiety that becomes routine. The loneliness that becomes expected. The sadness that quietly moves into the house and begins paying rent. Many men wake every morning carrying burdens they can no longer distinguish from themselves. The weight has sat on their shoulders for so long that they forget what it feels like to stand upright. And because they continue functioning, because they continue working, because they continue smiling, nobody notices the slow erosion taking place beneath the surface. A building rarely collapses because of one storm. It collapses because of years of unseen cracks. Men are often the same. There is a boy inside nearly every man, not the child who played football in the streets, not the teenager who chased dreams, but the boy who wanted to be loved without earning it. The boy who wanted someone to say, you do not have to prove your worth. Many men spend their entire lives trying to earn what they needed freely: approval, respect, affection, belonging. And this pursuit becomes exhausting. A man works harder, achieves more, builds more, provides more. Yet somewhere inside him, the child remains unconvinced. Because external success cannot heal internal abandonment. There are men with money who still feel invisible. Men with families who feel alone. Men surrounded by admiration who secretly believe they are not enough. The wound is older than the achievement, and until the wound is acknowledged, accomplishment often feels strangely empty. A father sits in his car outside his house. His children are asleep. His wife believes he is working late, but he is simply sitting, hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead. Because entering the house means becoming everyone else's strength again. The provider, the protector, the solver, the calm voice. And tonight, he does not know whether he has enough left. So he remains in the darkness. 10 minutes, 20, perhaps an hour. Nobody will ask where his mind went during those silent moments. Nobody will ask what he fears. Nobody will ask whether he feels lost. He will walk inside, smile, kiss his children, ask about everyone's day, and another invisible wound will remain unseen. Many men discover very early that their value is conditional. When they succeed, they receive praise. When they provide, they receive respect. When they solve problems, they receive appreciation. But when they fail, when they lose, when they struggle, the silence often becomes deafening. And so men begin constructing identities around usefulness. If I produce, I matter. If I earn, I matter. If I protect, I matter. If I succeed, I matter. But what happens when life removes these things? A lost job, a failed business, an injury, a divorce, a betrayal. Suddenly, the man is left asking a question he has avoided for years. Who am I when I cannot perform? This question terrifies many men because their identity has become inseparable from their function. The world applauded the role, but nobody taught them how to love the person. The philosopher Viktor Frankl once observed that human beings can endure almost any suffering if they possess meaning. But modern men often suffer from something more frightening than pain. They suffer from meaninglessness. Many wake each morning without understanding why they continue. The days become identical. Work, bills, obligations, exhaustion, sleep, repeat. Years pass. The dreams of youth quietly disappear. The musician becomes the accountant. The artist becomes the employee. The explorer becomes the exhausted commuter. And one day, a man realizes he has survived his own ambitions. This realization creates a grief few discuss, the grief of the unlived life, the mourning of possibilities, the death of versions of ourselves that never came into existence. Sometimes men are not grieving what they lost. They are grieving what they never became. There is a particular pain that arrives after heartbreak, not merely the loss of another person, but the loss of who you were with them. A man may lose a relationship and suddenly lose his routines, his plans, his imagined future, the children he pictured, the home he envisioned, the version of himself that existed inside another person's eyes. And because men are often taught to move on quickly, they carry heartbreak differently. Some bury themselves in work, some seek distractions, some become cold, some become cynical, some become strangers to themselves. People often ask women how they are after heartbreak. Men are frequently expected to recover quietly, to remain composed, to continue functioning. Yet some men spend years walking through emotional ruins nobody else can see. A broken heart does not always cry loudly. Sometimes it simply becomes silent. Eros, have you noticed how men often speak through jokes, through sarcasm, through humor? A man says, "I guess I'll just work until I die." Everyone laughs. A man says, "Nobody would notice if I disappeared." Everyone laughs. A man says, "I'm hanging on by a thread." Everyone laughs. Because men often reveal pain indirectly. The truth appears disguised, and because it arrives wearing humor, people fail to recognize it. The comedian becomes depressed. The friend who makes everyone laugh struggles alone. The strongest man in the room quietly falls apart. And afterward people say, "He seemed okay, But suffering rarely announces itself dramatically. More often it whispers. Carl Jung believed that what remains unconscious controls us. And many men live unconsciously wounded lives. The father wound, the rejection wound, the failure wound, the abandonment wound, the humiliation wound. Perhaps your father never saw you. Perhaps your mother expected perfection. Perhaps your first love betrayed you. Perhaps you failed publicly. Perhaps you experienced loss before you understood grief. These wounds do not disappear because years pass. Time alone does not heal. Time simply buries, and buried pain often becomes personality. The abandoned boy becomes emotionally distant. The rejected boy becomes desperate for validation. The humiliated boy becomes obsessed with success. The neglected boy becomes self-reliant to a fault. What we do not heal often becomes who we are. There was an old man sitting alone in a park. Someone asked him if he had children. He smiled. 3. Do they visit often? He looked down. Everyone is busy. There was no anger, only acceptance. But perhaps beneath that acceptance lived something deeper. The fear many men carry, that they are needed but not known, useful but not loved, present but not remembered. Many fathers spend decades sacrificing, working, providing, protecting. Yet, when the work ends, they discover that nobody truly knows who they are. Retirement becomes loneliness. Silence enters the house. The phone stops ringing, and the man who spent his life carrying others suddenly sits alone. Invisible again, modern men are surrounded by connection, yet starving for intimacy. Hundreds of followers, dozens of contacts, endless messages to say, I am struggling, I am afraid, I don't know what to do. The absence of these conversations creates emotional drought, and drought changes landscapes. It hardens the soil, cracks appear, life becomes difficult. Eventually, even rain struggles to penetrate. This is why some men seem unreachable, not because they do not want connection, but because they have lived too long without it. The ancient Stoics spoke often about endurance, but they never advocated emotional numbness. Marcus Aurelius wrote about compassion. Seneca wrote about grief. Epictetus spoke about human vulnerability. The Stoics understood something modern culture sometimes forgets. Strength is not the denial of emotion. Strength is remaining truthful within it. A man who feels fear and admits it possesses courage. A man who grieves and continues walking possesses strength. A man who asks for help demonstrates wisdom. Yet somewhere along the way, endurance became emotional isolation. Men were taught to carry, never share, to survive, never speak, to endure, never reveal, and these invisible wounds deepened. Perhaps the deepest wound many men carry is the belief that their suffering inconveniences others. They hesitate before speaking, apologize for their emotions, minimize their struggles, compare themselves to others. It could be worse. I'll deal with it. Other people have bigger problems, and so they remain silent. But pain ignored does not become smaller. It simply waits. The body keeps records. The mind keeps records. The soul keeps records. The sleepless nights, the clenched jaw, the anxiety, the irritability, the exhaustion, the emotional distance. These are often messages, not weaknesses. Messages from a self that has been neglected. Eros. There are men listening to these words who have not heard someone ask them a real question in years. Not, how's work? Not, everything okay? But, how are you carrying all of this? What hurts? What are you afraid of? What have you lost? These questions are dangerous because they invite truth. And truth often opens old doors. The grief of lost parents, the pain of failed dreams, the regret of wasted years, the loneliness, the disappointments, the hidden shame. But truth is also where healing begins. Because wounds kept in darkness rarely heal. They survive, they spread, they deepen. Perhaps nobody checks on men because men themselves have forgotten how to let others enter. Years of self-reliance become walls. Years of disappointment become armor. Years of rejection become distance. The man says, I don't need anyone. But often what he means is, I no longer trust anyone to stay. And this is one of the great tragedies of masculine suffering. The longing for connection exists alongside the fear of it. The desire to be known lives beside the terror of being vulnerable. So men wait, and others assume they are fine. The silence continues. There is a reason many men cry alone, in showers, in cars, late at night, not because their pain is less, but because privacy feels safer than exposure. The world allows men to suffer. It simply prefers them to suffer quietly, and so tears become secret. Grief becomes private. Fear becomes hidden. Yet, every hidden emotion asks eventually to be seen. Even the ocean must release its storms. Even the earth must tremble. Even the strongest mountain slowly cracks. Why should men be any different? Eros, if your wounds have become invisible, it does not mean they are unreal. If nobody sees your struggle, it does not mean you are weak. If your pain has remained unnamed for years, it does not mean it deserves silence. Perhaps your exhaustion is real. Perhaps your loneliness is real. Perhaps your grief is real. And perhaps acknowledging these things is not surrender. Perhaps it is the first act of courage, because a wound acknowledged can begin healing. A wound denied often becomes destiny. Somewhere in the shadows, a man is sitting alone, thinking he has become too damaged, too distant, too old, too broken, too tired, and perhaps he believes nobody would understand. But human suffering has always shared the same language: the fear of being forgotten, the fear of being unloved, the fear of meaninglessness, the fear of carrying life alone. You are not unusual for feeling these things. You are human. And the invisible wounds of men become visible only when one man speaks and another listens. Eros, do not mistake your scars for your identity. Do not mistake your burdens for your worth. You are more than your usefulness, more than your failures, more than your income, more than your achievements. The world may notice what you produce, but your soul asks a deeper question. Who are you when nobody needs anything from you? Sit with that question, because within it lives the beginning of your return. And remember this: the wounds nobody sees are often the wounds that shape entire lives. But the invisible is not permanent. What is carried can be shared, what is hidden can be spoken, and what has been wounded can still become whole. There is a strange moment that arrives in the life of many men. It does not come with thunder. There are no dramatic speeches, no music, no witnesses, only silence. A man wakes one morning and realizes that he has spent years waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to understand, waiting for someone to save him, waiting for someone to ask the question he has needed his entire life. Are you really okay? And perhaps nobody comes. The phone remains silent. The room remains empty. The world continues moving. At first, this realization feels cruel, but Eros, hidden within that cruelty, is a dangerous freedom. Because eventually, a man discovers that the person who must first check on him is himself. Not because people do not matter, not because brotherhood is unnecessary, but because the abandoned parts of ourselves often wait years for us to return. The child, the dreamer, the wounded boy, the frightened young man, the exhausted father, the disappointed son. All of them remain somewhere within us, waiting. There is an old story about a traveler lost in a desert. For days he searched for a city, for someone to rescue him, for a guide. But the longer he wandered, the more he realized that no one was coming. At first he cursed his loneliness. Later he feared it. Eventually he accepted it. And finally, he discovered something surprising. He had been carrying a compass the entire time. Many men live this story. They spend years waiting for validation, approval, recognition, affection, permission, a father who never gave it, a society that withholds it, a relationship that ended, a friend who disappeared. But life eventually asks every man, will you continue waiting to be chosen, or will you choose yourself? This question changes everything, because self-respect begins where the need for constant permission ends. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." Many men believe fate wounded them, but sometimes it was silence, sometimes it was shame, sometimes it was fear, sometimes it was the refusal to face old pain. The boy who was ignored becomes the man who avoids intimacy. The boy who was criticized becomes the man who fears failure. The boy who was abandoned becomes the man who leaves first. And so the cycle continues. Not because men are weak, but because pain that remains unconscious becomes destiny. The shadow follows us. The neglected self waits. The wounds ask to be acknowledged, not so they can destroy us, but so they can finally rest. Eros. There is a reason ancient cultures gave young men rites of passage. The boy entered the wilderness. He faced hardship, silence, fear, solitude, and when he returned, he came back transformed. Modern life often provides no such passage. Many men grow older. Few feel initiated. They possess adult responsibilities, but remain emotionally stranded between boyhood and manhood. They have jobs, bills, families, obligations. Yet somewhere inside, they still ask, when do I become enough? Perhaps manhood is not something society gives. Perhaps it is something we accept. The acceptance that life is difficult, that suffering is inevitable, that loneliness will visit, that loss will arrive, that failure will occur. And despite all of this, we continue, not because we are unbreakable, but because we discover meaning beyond comfort. Modern men often lose their why, not because they are lazy, not because they lack ambition, but because distraction has replaced meaning. The endless scroll, the endless comparison, the endless consumption, the endless noise. Entire lives disappear inside distractions. Years pass, dreams fade, the soul becomes quiet, and then a man wakes up one day and asks, where did my life go? Meaning does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it appears in simple places. A child's laughter, a difficult conversation, a morning walk, a promise kept, a friend called, a skill mastered, a burden carried willingly. Meaning often lives where attention lives. And modern men have had their attention stolen. There is a village in Japan where broken pottery is repaired with gold. The cracks are not hidden. They are highlighted. The object becomes more valuable because it broke. There is wisdom here. Many men spend years hiding their cracks. The divorce, the failure, the anxiety, the depression, the heartbreak, the mistakes. But perhaps your scars are not evidence of weakness. Perhaps they are evidence that you survived. A scar is the body saying, I was wounded, but I remained. The soul has scars as well. And sometimes the things we hide become the very things that allow us to understand others. The lonely man recognizes loneliness. The grieving man recognizes grief. The broken man recognizes pain. And suddenly suffering becomes compassion. The wound becomes wisdom. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire while reminding himself each morning, you will meet ungrateful people, selfish people, arrogant people. He understood something many men eventually learn. Life does not promise fairness. People leave, friends disappear, love ends, parents die, dreams fail. The world continues. At first this seems depressing, but it can also be liberating. Because if life guarantees nothing, then every meaningful moment becomes a gift. The conversation, the friendship, the sunrise, the quiet evening, the hand on your shoulder, the person who asks twice, the person who stays. These things become sacred, not because they last forever, but because they don't. Eros, perhaps nobody checked on you. Perhaps your pain went unnoticed. Perhaps you carried burdens nobody understood. Perhaps people failed you. This may be true. But another question waits. Will you become what wounded you? Many men become cold because others were cold. They become distant because others were distant. They become unavailable because nobody was available. The wound spreads, generation after generation, father to son, brother to brother, friend to friend, until someone decides, it ends here. The man who was never asked begins asking others. The man who was ignored begins noticing people. The man who suffered silently becomes a voice for others. Pain transformed becomes wisdom. Pain repeated becomes suffering. You do not control what happened to you, but you may influence what happens through you. There are men listening tonight who have not spoken to a friend in months. Call him. There are fathers who have not told their sons they love them. Tell them. There are brothers who stopped speaking years ago. Reach out. There are wounds that require courage. There are bridges waiting to be rebuilt. And yes, sometimes people disappoint us. Sometimes they do not answer. Sometimes they remain distant. But vulnerability is not weakness. It is risk. And every meaningful relationship requires risk. The strongest men are not those who need nobody. The strongest men are those who have the courage to be known. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But he also warned of the last man, the man who seeks only comfort, only pleasure, only safety. Modern life often encourages this. Consume, distract yourself, avoid pain, avoid struggle, avoid difficulty. Yet meaning frequently hides behind difficulty. The difficult conversation, the difficult workout, the difficult truth, the difficult responsibility. A man often discovers himself precisely where he wished not to go. Inside grief, inside failure, inside loneliness, inside uncertainty. These places feel like endings. Sometimes they are beginnings. Eros. Perhaps the deepest truth of all is this. Nobody checks on men because many people assume men are invincible. But men are not invincible. They are human. And human beings require connection, witness, belonging, love, meaning. No amount of money replaces it. No amount of success replaces it. No amount of achievement replaces it. The soul asks questions the world cannot answer. Who sees me? Who knows me? Who remains? And perhaps the answer begins with us, by becoming the friend we needed, the father we needed, the brother we needed, the man we once searched for. Imagine an old man sitting on his porch, the years behind him, the noise gone, the ambitions quiet, the body slower, the world moving on. What matters then? Not the salary, not the status, not the applause, perhaps only this. Did I love? Did I tell the truth? Did I remain kind? Did I become myself? Did I help another person feel less alone? At the end of life, men rarely regret loving too much. They regret waiting too long, waiting to speak, waiting to forgive, waiting to live, waiting to become. And so, Eros, if you find yourself alone tonight, do not mistake solitude for abandonment. If you find yourself wounded, do not mistake pain for defeat. If nobody checked on you, do not conclude that you are unworthy of love. You are not a machine. You are not merely a provider. You are not merely a role. You are not merely your productivity. You are a human soul carrying human burdens, and your suffering deserves witness. Even if the world forgot, even if people overlooked it, even if you yourself stopped looking, Eros, there will be nights when nobody calls, years when people misunderstand you, moments when your strength feels exhausted, days when you wonder whether anyone truly sees you. Do not disappear. Do not become the silence that wounded you. Sit with yourself. Learn your own voice. Forgive the boy who thought he had to earn love. Forgive the man who carried too much. Forgive the years spent surviving. And when you find another man carrying invisible burdens, ask again. Ask sincerely. Stay long enough to hear the real answer, because perhaps the reason you suffered was not merely to endure. Perhaps it was to recognize suffering in others. Perhaps the lonely become lanterns. Perhaps the wounded become healers. Perhaps the forgotten become witnesses. And one day, years from now, another man may sit across from you, exhausted, invisible, broken, and because you know the darkness, you will know how to sit beside him, not to fix him, not to rescue him, simply to say, I see you. And sometimes, Eros, those 3 words are enough to bring a man back from the edge. Walk gently, carry wisely, speak honestly, and remember, even if nobody checked on you, your life was never meant to pass unnoticed. And before you leave tonight, Eros, remember this. June is Men's Mental Health Month, a month that asks the world to pause, if only for a moment, and notice the burdens so many men carry in silence. The fathers who never speak, the sons who pretend they are fine, the brothers who smile while quietly falling apart, the men who spend years being strong for everyone else, while nobody asks if they are surviving themselves. Perhaps this video found you because you needed it, or perhaps it found you because someone you love does. So if these words spoke to your pain, your loneliness, your exhaustion, or the parts of yourself you have hidden from the world, do not let them end here. Share this with a father who carries too much. Share it with a brother who never talks. Share it with a friend who always says, I'm fine. Share it with the man who disappeared behind his responsibilities. You may never know whose silence you interrupt. You may never know whose darkness you enter. You may never know whose life changes because someone finally sent them a message that said, "I thought you needed this." And if this episode speaks to you, subscribe and join us here. This is not merely a channel. It is a gathering of forgotten men, a place for those who carry invisible wounds, a place for those searching for meaning, a place for those learning how to become whole. And if nobody has checked on you recently, allow this final epistle to remain with you. You are not weak for struggling. You are not invisible because you suffer. You are not forgotten because the world became quiet. Somewhere beyond this screen, another Eros walks beside you. Another man understands. Another soul carries similar burdens. And perhaps that is where healing begins. Until the next episode, walk gently, carry wisely, speak truthfully, and if you can, check on a man this week. Because sometimes the words that save a life are painfully simple. Brother, how are you really doing?